It was October 2023 in the San Bernardino Mountains of California, and the structure at the end of Forest Service Road 2N10 had been sitting vacant since the Shasta County Property Trust, that technically owned it, had finally won a long procedural dispute with the federal government over access rights. The foreman's name was Eddie Vale. He was 41 years old. He had been doing mountain demolition work for 11 years, and he had, in that time, found inside condemned structures a range of things he would not have predicted: cache-in walls, firearms and crawl spaces, animals living behind insulation that had no business being alive in the cold. He thought he had seen most of what a derelict building could contain. On the second morning of the job, his crew was pulling the foundation forms from the northwest corner of the structure, when one of the workers called out that something was lodged inside the concrete block cavity, sealed behind what looked like deliberately placed mortar, the kind of repair work you do yourself on a weekend afternoon. Vale pried it open with a flat bar. Inside was a Pelican waterproof case, the kind photographers and campers use for sensitive equipment, olive drab and latched shut. Inside the case, still dry after 29 years in a mountain foundation, was a Sony Hi8 camcorder tape. The date written on the label in black marker read September 3rd, 1994. That was the last date that anyone confirmed Marcus and Elaine Burrell were alive. What was on that tape, no one who knew this case was prepared for. But before we get to that, before we get to what the FBI found, and what it meant, and what it finally answered, you have to go back to the spring of 1994. Because to understand what that tape did, you first have to understand who Marcus and Elaine Burrell were, and why someone needed them to disappear. Marcus Burrell was 42 years old in the summer of 1994. He had been a supervisory special agent with the FBI's Los Angeles field office for 6 years, assigned to white-collar financial crimes, the kind of investigative work that requires patience and precision over the flash of field operations, the slow building of cases from document trails and wire transfers and offshore account records that most people never see, and fewer still could read fluently. He was good at it. His supervisor, a veteran named Phil Okoro, would describe Marcus in a 1995 FBI internal report as among the most methodical investigators in the division. He had testified in federal court 14 times. 11 of those cases had resulted in convictions. Elaine Burrell was 39. She had been a high school history teacher in Pasadena for 12 years, the kind of teacher whose former students called her by her first name for the rest of their lives because she had insisted on it and because formality would have felt wrong. She coached the debate team. She had a habit of correcting documentary narration out loud when she and Marcus watched television, which Marcus had stopped finding annoying sometime around their 3rd year of marriage. They had been married in 1986. They did not have children. They had talked about it, on and off, and had arrived at a quiet understanding that what they had was enough, and that the hiking trips and the jazz records and the 3-day weekends in the mountains were a life that fit them well. The cabin on Forest Service Road 2N10 had belonged to Marcus's family since the 1970s. His parents had bought it when he was a teenager, and the family had gone up every summer. After his mother died in 1989, the cabin passed informally to Marcus. He and Elaine went up 4 or 5 times a year, long weekends, no agenda. The San Bernardino pines and the cold mountain air and the particular silence that you cannot find below 7,000 feet. They had a Sony Hi8 camcorder they brought along to document the trips. Home movies, the 2 of them on the porch. The view from the ridge. Small, private, ordinary footage of 2 people who were comfortable in each other's presence. In September of 1994, Marcus was in the final stages of a federal financial crimes investigation that his supervisors considered one of the most significant cases the LA field office had developed in a decade. The target was a man named Gerald Stroud, a real estate developer and financial broker based in Rancho Cucamonga, whose network of shell companies and fraudulent investment vehicles had, according to the case file, stripped an estimated $47 million from a range of investors across Southern California. Stroud was connected. He had business relationships with county officials, with a sitting state assemblyman, and with a network of attorneys and accountants who had, until Marcus began methodically pulling threads, appeared entirely legitimate. Marcus had been building the case for 3 years. By August of 1994, he had told Elaine that it was close. That was the word he used. Close. In the first week of September 1994, Marcus and Elaine drove the 2 hours from Pasadena up to the cabin for a long weekend. Marcus brought his case files. Elaine brought a stack of student papers. They brought groceries for 3 days, a bottle of Sonoma Pinot Noir, and the Sony Hi8. They were going to rest. They were going to walk the Ridge Trail on Saturday morning. Nobody saw them come back down. At 7:15 a.m. on Tuesday, September 6, 1994, a Caltrans maintenance crew on the highway shoulder near the Forest Service Road junction noticed an unoccupied Subaru wagon. Dark green, California plates, with the windows up and no visible reason to be parked where it was. They made a note. They kept working. By noon, the note had not gone anywhere. At 4:40 p.m., Marcus Burrell's supervisor, Phil Okoro, received a call from the FBI Field Office Administrative Desk, confirming that Marcus had not reported to work that morning and had not called in. Okoro knew Marcus had been at the cabin. He called the cabin's landline. No answer. He called Elaine's school. She had not come in either. He called the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department. At 6:11 p.m., 2 deputies arrived at Forest Service Road 2N10. The cabin's front door was unlocked. The lights were on. On the kitchen table, 2 coffee cups, used, a plate with toast crumbs, and a butter knife laid across it. Elaine's papers, stacked and annotated in red pen. Marcus's case files, sorted into labeled folders beside an open legal pad covered in his handwriting. The Subaru wagon was not in the driveway. The camcorder was not on the counter where Marcus typically left it. The cabin's back door was not merely unlocked. It was open, swinging slightly in the early September wind off the pines. Neither Marcus nor Elaine was there. Neither their bodies nor any sign of what had happened to them was found on the immediate property. What no one registered that first evening, in the growing darkness and the urgency of the initial search, what was documented in the case file photographs but never drawn to anyone's attention in the first year, was a small patch of fresh mortar in the northwest corner of the cabin's foundation wall. The kind of repair that blends in when you are looking for people, not for what someone might have hidden. By the following morning, September 7th, the Subaru wagon had been located at the bottom of a ravine 6 miles east of the cabin, a section of mountain road where a vehicle could leave the shoulder on a curve without a guardrail and fall 300 feet. The car was consistent with impact. It was not consistent with an accident. And Marcus and Elaine Burrell were not in it. Gone. Both of them. Gone. The investigation that followed was, given Marcus's position, unlike any missing persons case that San Bernardino County had previously worked. The FBI's Los Angeles field office was immediately involved, as both an investigative resource and, in a complicated and painful way, a potentially interested party, given that Marcus had been working an open case at the time of his disappearance. The initial lead agent on the Burrell case was a 15-year Bureau veteran named Sandra Kowalski, who had been one of Marcus's colleagues in financial crimes, and who, by every account, took the assignment as both a professional obligation and something considerably more personal. The first and most obvious line of inquiry was Gerald Stroud. Stroud was brought in for a voluntary interview within 72 hours. He came with 2 attorneys. He was cooperative in the way that people with 2 attorneys are cooperative, present, responsive, and completely uninformative. He had an alibi for the Labor Day weekend, a real estate conference in Palm Springs, documented by hotel records and attended by 60 other people who confirmed his presence. He had not, he said, been aware that Agent Burrell was assigned to any investigation involving his business affairs. His attorneys noted, pointedly, that no charges had been filed against their client and that his appearance was entirely voluntary. Kowalski had him back in twice more over the following month. The alibi held. The connection was inferential. The documentation linking Stroud to the disappearance was circumstantial at best, and the Bureau's own oversight protocols created friction between the financial crimes investigation, which continued under a different agent, and the missing persons case, which had its own evidentiary standards and its own institutional pressures. By December 1994, Marcus and Elaine had been missing for 3 months. The investigation had generated 47 witness interviews, 4 executed search warrants, and no arrests. The ravine where the Subaru was found had been searched by dive teams. The forest for a 10-mile radius had been walked by search crews. Nothing was found. Elaine's parents, a retired minister named Howard Greer, and his wife Margaret, had come from Ohio in September and had not gone home. They stayed in a rented room in Big Bear Lake, 2 miles from the FBI's field command, and they called Kowalski every Tuesday morning at 9. Not demanding, not confrontational, just present. Just making sure she knew they were still there, that the case still had people attached to it who would notice if it was quietly set aside. Margaret Greer kept a small framed photograph of Marcus and Elaine on the rented room's dresser, a photo from a camping trip in the Sierras. Both of them laughing at something outside the frame. She dusted it every morning. She did it the way you maintain something you refuse to let be forgotten. Gerald Stroud was indicted on federal fraud charges in February 1995, using the case materials Marcus had assembled before his disappearance. He was convicted in 1997. He was sentenced to 14 years. He served 8 with good behavior and was released in 2005. He had, throughout his trial and his incarceration, never been charged with anything related to the Burrells. He denied any involvement. That denial stood, legally, officially, on paper for the next 26 years. By 2000, Howard Greer had died. Margaret had moved back to Ohio. She had taken the photograph with her. Kowalski had transferred to a different division. The case file had been officially designated cold in 1999 and assigned to the Bureau's cold case unit, where it joined hundreds of others. The cabin on Forest Service Road 2N10 sat empty, its roof weathering, its foundations settling quietly into the mountain soil. Elaine's papers were still on the table inside. They had been photographed as evidence in 1994 and then left, nobody being sure quite what to do with them. By 2005, the table had rotted enough that they had fallen to the floor. By 2015, they were dust. Every case on this channel begins with someone who refused to stop. Months go into the records, the case files, the phone calls with families who have been waiting longer than anyone should have to wait. If you want us to keep telling stories like this one, take a second to like this video and subscribe, and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. We read every one. Now, let's get back to Marcus and Elaine. In the spring of 2023, the FBI's Cold Case Unit assigned a new review agent to 43 open cases from the Los Angeles Field Office archives as part of a systematic reinvestigation initiative. The agent assigned to the Burrell file was a 12-year Bureau veteran named Carlos Reyes, who had spent most of his career in financial crimes. The same division Marcus had worked in, and who had, as a young agent in the late 1990s, heard about the Burrell case the way you hear about things that become myth in an institution. Spoken of quietly, carrying weight. Never quite resolved. He had requested the assignment. He spent 6 weeks reading everything. He visited the original crime scene locations. He pulled the Stroud trial transcripts. And then, in August 2023, he did something that nobody in 29 years had done. He filed a formal request to access the cabin itself, which had been sitting in a property dispute that had run quietly through 3 different administrative bodies since 1998, and had only been resolved, finally, by a federal magistrate's ruling in June of that year. The property trust contacted the demolition contractor. The contractors scheduled the crew. Agent Reyes drove up to the mountain on the second morning of demolition. Not because he had a specific reason to be there, but because he had been visiting every physical location connected to the case. And because the cabin was about to cease to exist, and he wanted to see it before it did. He was standing near the northwest corner of the foundation, watching Eddie Vale's crew work, when the worker called out that something was inside the cavity. Reyes was there when Vale pried the mortar free. He was there when the Pelican case came out. He looked at the date on the label, September 3rd, 1994. He stood still for a moment, in the way that people stand still when something large is happening and they need a second to understand the size of it. Then he called his supervisor in Los Angeles. "I need an evidence team up here," he said, "right now." The tape was processed at the Bureau's field lab in Los Angeles within 48 hours. The Hi8 format required a deck that took 2 days to locate. When the footage played, it showed what most of the tape contained: the couple on the porch, the ridge trail, the pines in the September light, Elaine correcting something Marcus said about a historical event she had apparently been waiting all weekend to address, both of them laughing. And then the camera, set down on the kitchen table and left running, recorded something it was never meant to record. A Sony Hi8 tape holds 2 hours. The couple had used about 40 minutes for their own footage. The remaining hour and 20 minutes had captured, in fixed angle, partially obstructed but entirely audible detail, what happened when an unwanted visitor arrived at the cabin on the evening of September 3rd. The camera was behind a shelf. It was angled toward the door. In the low light of the cabin interior, it had recorded a face, a voice, a name spoken aloud, a conversation that went wrong, and then the sound of the back door. It was all there. 29 years in a mountain foundation, sealed in a waterproof case that Marcus Burrell had placed there himself. Not because he had known what was coming, but because he had been careful his entire career about preserving evidence, and old habits do not ask permission before they act. The name on the tape was not Gerald Stroud. It was a man named Victor Calloway, Stroud's former business partner, the one who had split from Stroud's operation in 1992, and who had, according to the financial crimes case file, been separately involved in the management of several of Stroud's shell entities in ways that Marcus had been. Investigating in parallel, Calloway had appeared in the Burrell case file in 1994 as a peripheral figure, interviewed once in October of that year, describing a professional relationship with Stroud that had ended cordially, and a personal relationship with the Burrells that he characterized as non-existent. He had provided a Labor Day weekend alibi, a family barbecue in Pomona, confirmed by 4 relatives. He had been noted as low priority. He had never been revisited. In 2023, Victor Calloway was 68 years old. He had been living in Scottsdale, Arizona since 2001. He had a real estate business. He had been married 3 times. He had, according to the neighbors who later spoke to the press, seemed like a reasonably pleasant man who kept to himself, maintained his property, and drove a late-model pickup. Agent Reyes flew to Arizona on a Saturday morning in November 2023, accompanied by a team of 4. They had a federal arrest warrant and a copy of the tape. They found Calloway at home. He answered the door himself. He looked at Reyes for a moment. Then, he looked at what Reyes was holding. Not the warrant, which he hadn't seen yet, but the case Reyes was carrying, a clear evidence bag containing a standard Hi-8 cassette tape. Calloway looked at it for a long time. He didn't say anything. His expression, as Reyes later described it to investigators, was not fear. It was something more like exhaustion. The kind that comes from carrying a weight for so long that putting it down is almost a relief. He did not resist. He did not call for an attorney until they were already in the vehicle. He said nothing in the car, looking out the window at the Arizona desert going past, at the clean flat light of a November morning, at the distance between where he was and where he had been for 29 years. At the federal courthouse in Los Angeles, Victor Calloway was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder in the deaths of Marcus and Elaine Burrell. The charges also included obstruction of a federal investigation and evidence tampering. He entered a not guilty plea. His trial was scheduled for the spring of 2025. The community of former FBI colleagues who had known Marcus Burrell did not react quietly to the news. Nor did the debate team alumni who had found each other on the internet over the years and kept a group going in Elaine's honor. Margaret Greer, 81 years old in her house in Ohio, was called by Agent Reyes personally. She sat with the phone in her hand for a long time after the call ended. Her daughter, who was in the room, said she didn't cry. She just sat very still, with both hands around the phone. The way you hold something you have been waiting 29 years to hold. Marcus Burrell was 42 years old. He was methodical. He was precise. He had testified 14 times in federal court and built cases from paper trails that other people could not read and he could not put down. He had a habit, ingrained over years of careful investigative work, of preserving evidence even when he didn't know yet what he was preserving it for. He had set that camera down on a kitchen table in the mountains and gone about his evening without knowing what it was recording, without knowing what he was leaving behind, without knowing that the care he had taken his entire professional life would outlast him by 3 decades and would be, in the end, the thing that answered the question of what happened to him. Elaine Burrell was 39 years old. She corrected documentary narration out loud because she had spent 12 years teaching young people that precision matters, that the details are where the truth lives. She had student papers on that kitchen table, graded in red pen, all the way to the last morning. She had a life that was ordinary and full and entirely her own, and it was taken from her on a September evening in the mountains when she had done nothing except be in the same room as the wrong man at the wrong moment. Agent Reyes said in a press statement after the arrest that the case had reminded him of something that every investigator learns and sometimes forgets, that evidence does not expire. That something sealed in a foundation in 1994 is still evidence in 2023, if you know where to look, and if someone has the patience to look. Howard and Margaret Greer had that patience. Kowalski had that patience. Reyes had it. And Marcus Burrell, on the evening of September 3, 1994, without knowing he was doing it, had given them something to be patient for. What does it mean that a man's professional instincts outlasted his life and ultimately answered the question of how his life ended? What do we owe the families? Margaret Greer with her photograph on the dresser. Elaine's former students with their group that kept going in her name. Who carried these cases in the decades when the institutions couldn't or wouldn't? And what does Victor Calloway's face look like to you in that doorway in Arizona when he sees what's in the evidence bag? And what do you think he was feeling in that moment? Leave your thoughts in the comments. If this is your first case on this channel, subscribe. There are more waiting. Justice found Marcus and Elaine Burrell after 29 years. Stories like theirs are why this channel exists. If you believe the truth is always worth pursuing, no matter how long it takes, subscribe, and thank you for being here.